March 23, 1918. A Friday morning in Paris began as any other. The city, though weary from years of war, hummed with the familiar rhythms of life. Shopkeepers were opening their stalls, and the streets filled with the purposeful stride of citizens on their way to work. At 16 minutes past 7, without warning, that rhythm was shattered. A deafening explosion tore through the Place de la République, right in the capital's heart. A column of flame and smoke clawed at the sky. Panic erupted. People scattered in every direction, their faces masks of confusion and terror. For there had been no sound of an approaching aircraft, no telltale whistle of incoming artillery. Then, 20 minutes later, another blast ripped through a different quarter of the city. Then another, and another. The shells fell with a terrifying, almost metronomic regularity, every 15 to 20 minutes, sowing chaos and dread among the Parisians. The French High Command was paralyzed by an impossible mystery. The nearest German positions were more than 100 kilometers from the capital, yet the maximum range of the most powerful cannons of the era was barely 30 kilometers. It was a riddle that bordered on an act of technological sorcery. The acoustic ranging stations, designed to pinpoint the location of enemy guns by the sound of their firing, remained silent. They had detected nothing. Reconnaissance aircraft scoured the front lines, but found no new enemy batteries. It was as if the shells were materializing from the ether, a phantom menace sent by some diabolical, unseen hand. But 120 kilometers away, hidden deep within a forest near the small town of Crépy, something truly monstrous was at work. Concealed beneath a canopy of trees, a steel behemoth rested on a massive railway platform. It was a cannon 34 meters long. Its barrel, weighing an almost unbelievable 138 tons, was so immense that it visibly sagged under its own weight. German engineers had been forced to brace it with a complex web of steel cables. Pariser Kanon, the Paris gun. Kaiser Wilhelm II's secret weapon, the product of years of clandestine work by the engineers of the Crépy firm. The story of this monster began in 1914, when the German High Command issued a directive that seemed to border on fantasy. Create a weapon capable of striking Paris from behind their own lines. The objective was not truly military, it was psychological. To break the spirit of the French, to prove that nowhere, not even their cherished capital, was safe. The Crépy engineers took up the challenge and quickly realized its staggering difficulty. The solution they devised was born of brutal ingenuity. They took the worn-out 380mm barrels from naval battleships and painstakingly bored them out, inserting a new, smaller, rifled liner. The composite structure achieved the necessary length, but the sagging barrel presented a new crisis, one solved by the intricate truss of steel cables that held the weapon true. And so, from the marriage of audacious engineering and sheer psychological will, a new form of terror was born. It was a weapon that did not conquer territory but minds. A gun whose greatest impact was not the crater it left in the earth, but the fear it carved into the heart of a nation. It was a chilling prophecy of a future where distance would no longer offer sanctuary, and war could fall, quite literally, from a clear blue sky. The sound of the shot was a physical blow, a concussion that rolled across the French countryside. But after the thunder, a strange silence. And then, another sound, a low, resonant hum. The colossal gun barrel, mounted in a bizarre steel lattice that resembled nothing so much as a construction crane, whirred agonizing minutes. The gun crew could do nothing but wait, watching the giant tremble until it finally fell still. This was only the beginning of the weapon's strange and demanding life cycle. After a firing session, the barrel, warped by the immense heat and vibration, had to be removed by powerful cranes and painstakingly straightened. But the most astonishing feature of the Paris gun was a secret it kept locked within its own steel heart. The weapon was, quite literally, designed to devour itself. With every shot, the incandescent fury of a 196-kilogram powder charge, combined with the friction of a 120-kilogram shell, would scour away the barrel's inner lining. The rifling, the very soul of the gun, was being eroded into oblivion. When freshly forged, its caliber was precisely 210 millimeters. After just a few dozen shots, it had widened to 214. Faced with a self-cannibalizing weapon, German ordnance engineers devised a solution of breathtaking, almost obsessive ingenuity. They created a library of projectiles. Each shell was meticulously numbered, and each was manufactured with a progressively increasing diameter. The first shell was exactly 210 millimeters. The second was a fraction thicker, the third thicker still, and so on. The firing shell would refuse to enter the barrel at all, or it would rattle down his brutal process for only 65 to 68 shots before it was rendered useless. Over the project's entire existence, the Germans forged just 7 of these barrels, each one costing an astronomical sum and demanding the most advanced machining of the era. Replacing a worn-out barrel was a major engineering operation in itself, a multi-day ordeal involving specialized cranes and teams of skilled workers. This entire 256-ton behemoth was mounted on a custom-built railway platform, allowing the entire apparatus to be moved along the tracks to new firing positions. The preparation for a single shot resembled not a military operation, but a complex scientific experiment. Technicians would painstakingly inspect the barrel's interior with an array of mirrors and lanterns, scrutinizing every single millimeter of the surface for the slightest hint of a fissure or deformation. Then the ballisticians would take over. They received the latest meteorological reports, calculating the shell's immense journey through the heavens. They had to account for the direction and force of the wind at multiple altitudes, the ambient air temperature, the humidity, even the atmospheric pressure. The slightest miscalculation, a minor oversight in this storm of variables, could result in the shell missing its Parisian target by several kilometers. The projectile itself was a marvel of metallurgy, forged from a uniquely tough steel alloy capable of surviving the monstrous G-forces of its launch. Yet for all its mass, it carried a payload of just 15 kilograms of high explosive. The rest of its weight was dedicated to a thick, robust casing, designed not for maximum destruction, but for mere survival through the brutal ascent into the stratosphere. When all was ready, the command was given. A flash, a roar, and the shell's incredible voyage would begin. Erupting from the muzzle at more than 1.5 kilometers per second, it clawed its way into the sky on an almost vertical trajectory. Within 20 seconds, it had already reached an altitude of 20 kilometers, punching through the troposphere and into the thin, cold air above. It was a monument to human intellect and industrial might, a machine that reached for the stars, only to rain down terror. And in its own violent, fleeting existence, consuming itself with every shot, it serves as a chilling reminder that the same genius that can map the cosmos can also be bent toward the singular, terrible purpose of its own undoing. It ascends, punching through the troposphere and clawing its way into the silent, unforgiving stratosphere. Another minute, and the shell reaches the apex of its trajectory, a staggering 40 kilometers above the Earth. Here, in this desolate realm, the air is a near-perfect vacuum. the temperature plummets to a bone-chilling -50 degrees Celsius. For a single, fleeting moment, the projectile hangs motionless in the grip of zero gravity, a silent testament to human ingenuity and malice. Before gravity reasserts its claim, the descent begins. It screams back into the dense layers of the atmosphere, friction heating its steel skin to several hundred degrees, a man-made meteor on a collision course with the heart of civilization. The flight time, from launch to impact, is a mere 3 minutes. In that sliver of time, it traverses 120 kilometers of contested Earth. Its destination? Paris. The accuracy of such a weapon was, by any military standard, abysmal. The Germans could only hope to strike a target the size of a large city. The dispersal of the shells could be measured in kilometers. This is why the Paris gun could never be used against specific military installations. Not barracks, not warehouses, not command posts. It was something else entirely. It was an instrument of pure terror, engineered exclusively for psychological warfare against a civilian population. Each shell fell on a random city block, a fact that made the bombardments all the more horrifying. There was no predicting where the next explosion would tear through the fabric of daily life. A man could be quietly sipping his morning coffee in a cafe, and the next minute, the building next door would be a smoking ruin of splintered wood and shattered stone. The French government found itself in an utterly desperate position as panic seized the capital. The people of Paris had no idea where this death was coming from, or how to possibly defend themselves against it. A mass evacuation began. 100,000 families abandoned their homes, choking the roads with horse-drawn carts piled high with their worldly possessions. Production in the city's factories ground to a halt. Commerce withered. The vibrant life of the metropolis was paralyzed. This, precisely this, was the German objective. Not the physical destruction of the city, but the moral corrosion of its people. Over the entire period of the bombardment, 303 shells were fired. 256 people were killed. Another 620 were wounded. From a cold military perspective, these figures were negligible. A single day of heavy fighting on the front lines would claim tens of thousands of soldiers. But the psychological effect was colossal. The French High Command scrambled for a solution. Every attempt to locate the gargantuan cannon using sound-ranging stations failed. They simply could not register a blast from such an impossible distance. Reconnaissance aircraft scoured the German rear, but found nothing suspicious. The gun was a master of disguise, artfully concealed in a forest, its position constantly shrouded by tactical smokescreens during firing. The generals demanded that intelligence find the damned thing at any cost. An act of desperation was approved. To parachute agents behind the front lines, deep into German-controlled territory, the first aircraft, carrying 2 scouts, circled over enemy positions, searching for a suitable place to land. It never found one, and was forced to return, its mission a failure. The second aircraft was not so fortunate. It was caught and savaged by German anti-aircraft artillery. The plane and the agents inside were lost. The hunt for a physical object had failed. But the weapon they were truly fighting was never just assembly of steel and gunpowder. It was an idea, a terrifying whisper carried on the high winds that told every citizen they were no longer safe. It was the dawn of a new kind of war, where the battlefield had no boundaries, and the front line could be anywhere. They were losing people, and they were losing time. The shells continued to fall on the capital, arriving with a frightening, almost clockwork regularity. For every crater that scarred the Parisian boulevards, A deeper one was carved into the morale of the nation. At last, a glimmer of hope. A French agent operating deep within the German heartland managed to acquire intelligence on the secret weapon's location. The data, a set of precise coordinates, was smuggled through clandestine channels back to Paris. The French High Command, desperate for a victory, acted without hesitation. The order was given: a massive, overwhelming artillery strike. For 3 days and 3 nights, French batteries methodically pounded the designated square of terrain. A storm of steel was unleashed, with thousands of shells churning the earth into a lifeless moonscape. The gun crews worked to the point of exhaustion, feeding their cannons a colossal quantity of munitions, driven by the hope that with each deafening report, they were closer to silencing the hated gun. But when the smoke finally cleared and the reconnaissance reports came in, the truth was devastating. The agent had been mistaken. Or worse, he had been deliberately misinformed by German counterintelligence. The point they had obliterated was a full 5 miles from the Paris gun's true position. The French had expended enormous resources for nothing, and the German weapon, untouched, continued its malevolent work. The German command, however, was under no illusions. They understood perfectly well that sooner or later the French would pinpoint the cannon's true lair. And so they devised a cunningly layered system of camouflage and disinformation. Around the single emplacement of the Paris gun, they deployed approximately 30 conventional artillery batteries of varying calibers. All of these batteries received the strictest of orders. They were to open fire only at the precise moment the main gun discharged. The synchronization was perfect. In the exact second the supergun fired, dozens of other cannons roared to life across that entire sector of the front. The resulting shockwave from so many simultaneous detonations created a deliberate acoustic chaos. French sound ranging stations, the primary tool for locating enemy artillery, were simply overwhelmed. Their delicate instruments registered dozens of batteries firing at once, but to distinguish the one true source from this deafening choir of destruction was utterly impossible. Beyond this auditory smokescreen, the Germans employed sophisticated visual camouflage. The position was encircled by high trees and draped in immense camouflage nets. During a firing sequence, special teams would ignite smoke screens in several locations at once, obscuring the telltale muzzle flash and confounding aerial reconnaissance. The vital railway lines, which brought the colossal gun and its ammunition to the front, were meticulously linked in adjacent units, just a few kilometers away, had no idea that a superweapon existed in their midst. Security for the battery was handled by specially selected units, whose personnel had all signed non-disclosure agreements under the threat of a firing squad. Anyone who wandered too close was turned away with the excuse that the area was a high-priority command post or a sensitive ammunition depot. Access was forbidden. Maintaining the Paris gun itself demanded a monumental effort. Its crew was not a collection of common soldiers, but a hand-picked team of highly qualified specialists: artillerists, mechanics, ballisticians, and meteorologists. Each shot was a major event, an intricate scientific procedure requiring hours of painstaking preparation. It was a testament to the profound and often terrifying ingenuity that humanity reserves for the art of war. The ritual began not with gunpowder, but with numbers. Meteorologists, far from the front, would gather their data, charting the invisible currents and densities of the upper atmosphere to an altitude of 40 kilometers. Their findings were then passed to the ballisticians, men who waged war with logarithmic slide rules and complex tables, performing calculations of excruciating difficulty. Simultaneously, the mechanics would begin their own painstaking inspection. Every node of the great gun was examined, the tension of its supporting cables checked and rechecked, the delicate mechanisms of its traverse and elevation anointed with grease. A separate team, with the reverence of priests, prepared the offering. The shell and its propellant charge were brought from a protected bunker. They were inspected for the slightest imperfection, their serial numbers verified to ensure the precise sequence was maintained. The loading itself was a perilous operation, a dance with giants. A special winch would groan under the strain of the 120-kilogram projectile, guiding it gently into the breech. A single mistake here, the slightest damage to the barrel's rifling, could spell absolute catastrophe. The shell might jam, or worse, detonate prematurely. Behind the shell came the propellant, 196 kilograms of high explosive, carefully packed into several fine silk bags. Then, the massive breech block was swung into place. It was a component of such immense weight that closing it required the coordinated effort of several strong men. Only then would the battery commander step forward. He would personally verify every preparation, cross-reference every calculation, his eyes scanning for any flaw. And only when he was satisfied would the command to fire be given. A gunner would pull the lanyard. The sound was not merely a bang, it was a deafening, soul-shaking concussion that tore through the air. A tongue of flame, several meters long, erupted from the muzzle. The entire platform shuddered from the recoil, and the very earth trembled for hundreds of meters around. The immense barrel, now free, would begin its long, slow oscillation, swinging forward. But for every moment of thunder, there were hours of silent suffering. After just 20 to 30 shots, the barrel required a thorough cleansing. Inside, a thick layer of soot and the fused copper remnants of the shell's driving bands would build up. Special teams of cleaners would crawl into the bore, spending hours in the dark, scraping away the deposits with metal brushes and wiping the surface with chemical compounds. It was a filthy, dangerous job. The residual heat from the firing created an unbearable inferno within the steel tube, while toxic powder gases seared the lungs. Many of these men developed chronic poisoning and respiratory diseases, a slow sacrifice to the weapon they served. Yet the German High Command was relentless, pushing the crews to maintain the schedule, no matter the human cost. From a purely military perspective, the Paris gun's effectiveness was questionable, a fact not lost on the German officers themselves. Each shell cost an astronomical sum, its production demanding the highest quality steel and the most precise machining. The powder charge for a single shot could have supplied a conventional artillery battery for an entire day of fighting. The barrel itself, after a brief life of just 60-odd shots, was completely worn out, and its replacement cost a sum comparable to that of a small warship. This on top of the immense crew of highly qualified specialists, the full company of soldiers required for security, and the constant need for camouflage and relocation. It was a weapon of terror, not of strategy, a monument not to victory, but to the terrifying capacity of human ingenuity when utterly divorced from human wisdom. The weapon demanded a colossal appetite for resources that, on the blood-soaked battlefields of the Western Front, could have been used with devastating efficiency. Within the German Artillery Directorate, pragmatic generals ran the numbers. Their calculations were stark. For the immense cost of creating and operating the single Paris gun, they could have fielded several dozen conventional heavy batteries, each capable of inflicting incomparably greater damage upon the enemy. The final statistics were, for a weapon of such renown, almost pitiful. Over its operational life, It fired just 303 shells. The human cost in Paris: 256 killed, 620 wounded. A single shot from this behemoth, it was determined, cost more than the complete monthly upkeep of an entire infantry company. And the results were often negligible. Many of the projectiles fell harmlessly in the suburbs or missed the city altogether, burying themselves in empty fields, leaving behind nothing but a crater in the French soil. Some plunged into the Seine, raising fantastic columns of water, but causing no material damage. There were instances where shells struck buildings already reduced to rubble, or landed silently in deserted parks. But for Germany's political leadership, with Kaiser Wilhelm II at its head, the question was viewed through a very different lens. For them, the Paris gun was not merely a weapon. It was a resonant symbol of German technical might, a thundering declaration of superiority. It was proof that German engineers could forge arms beyond the wildest dreams of any other nation. The very act of striking an enemy capital from a distance of over 100 kilometers seemed a fantastical achievement, a feat worthy of national adoration. The Reich's propaganda machine seized upon the supergun's image, painting lurid pictures of French helplessness before this German wonder weapon. Newspapers ran breathless articles describing the supposed panic in Paris, the exodus of its population, and a French government rapidly losing control. And on the streets of Paris, the psychological effect was, in fact, profound. The city's people lived in a state of constant, gnawing fear, forever waiting for the next invisible blow to fall. The sheer impossibility of predicting where the next shell would land created an atmosphere of all-pervading anxiety. Parisians became hesitant to walk the streets. Many businesses closed their doors, schools ceased their lessons. Some seriously believed the Germans were bombarding them from some kind of flying fortress or from zeppelins rendered invisible to the naked eye. Rumors swirled of secret aeroplanes capable of ascending to impossible altitudes to drop their deadly cargo. The French government did little to dispel these fictions. To officially acknowledge the existence of a German supergun would be to simultaneously admit their own complete powerlessness to find and destroy it. And so, while Paris trembled under a phantom menace, German engineers continued to refine their creation. They experimented with various types of projectiles, desperately trying to increase their destructive power. Designs were drafted for shells with larger explosive payloads, with shrapnel-filled warheads, and even for chemical rounds containing poisonous gas. Yet every attempt to increase the warhead's potency ran into the unyielding physics of the gun itself. The weapon was an instrument of terror, not of conquest. Its true target, not the city's stone, but its soul. The engineers were battling the very laws of physics. Each projectile, a slender dart of steel, was required to endure forces almost beyond comprehension. The casing had to be forged with impossible strength, enough to survive the monstrous acceleration within the barrel and the searing, incandescent heat of its fiery ascent through the stratosphere. Any infinitesimal weakness in the design, any flaw in the metallurgy, resulted in immediate and total failure. The shell would simply cease to exist, disintegrating either in the violent crucible of the gun's chamber or in the thin, cold air of its trajectory. Several of these experimental firings ended in utter catastrophe. Instead of arcing gracefully toward their distant target, the projectiles would prematurely detonate, their fragments raining down not on Paris, but on German-controlled territory. It was a weapon that threatened to consume its own masters. In the spring of 1918, the German High Command staked everything on one final, desperate gamble. a massive offensive on the Western Front designed to shatter the Allied lines and seize Paris before the full might of the American expeditionary forces could be brought to bear. The Paris gun, the Kaiser Wilhelm Geschütz, was to be the psychological spearhead of this assault. Its purpose was not merely to destroy, but to terrorize, to exert an unbearable pressure upon the French government and the very soul of its capital. The shelling grew more intense, a relentless, unpredictable drumbeat of death. On some days, as many as 10 shells would fall from the heavens, each one a thunderclap from a clear blue sky. One of the most horrific tragedies of this campaign unfolded on Good Friday, the 29th of March. A shell, traveling silently at supersonic speed, plunged through the roof of the Church of Saint-Gervais during a packed service. The ancient stone vaults collapsed upon the worshippers below. The collapse claimed 88 souls, a congregation of men, women, and children. It was the single bloodiest episode in the history of the Paris gun's deployment, an act that sent a wave of outrage and revulsion across the entire world. But the German offensive, for all its fury, had begun to falter. The Allied lines bent, but they did not break. Bolstered by fresh American divisions, they absorbed the attacks and began a punishing counteroffensive. By August of 1918, the truth was undeniable. Germany was losing the war. Across the Western Front, the great German armies began their long, bitter retreat, ceding captured territory and falling back toward their own borders. And with this retreat, the Paris gun suddenly found itself in mortal danger of being captured. Its carefully concealed position was now perilously close to the advancing front lines. The risk of a French breakthrough became a terrifyingly real possibility. The German command issued the order. The priceless superweapon was to be evacuated into the deep rear. Dismantling and transporting such a behemoth was a monumental operation in its own right. First, the colossal barrel had to be lifted from its carriage using powerful cranes. Then, the entire railway platform, a masterpiece of engineering, had to be broken down into transportable sections. All of this had to be accomplished under the constant threat of Allied air raids and the creeping range of their artillery. The work was done almost exclusively at night, under the eerie glow of shrouded searchlights. The crew worked at a feverish pace, knowing that every hour of delay brought the enemy one step closer to their prize. Finally, the Paris gun was reduced to a collection of massive components, loaded onto a series of railway cars, and spirited away into the heart of Germany. The last shell screamed towards the French capital on the 9th of August, 1918. After that, the legendary weapon vanished from the theater of war, forever. As the German retreat continued, French intelligence redoubled its efforts. Agents scoured abandoned positions, desperately hoping to find some trace, some clue to the location of the mysterious cannon that had haunted their city. They were hunting for a ghost, a phantom of steel and fire that had already dissolved back into the myths of the war, a chilling testament to an ambition that had reached for the heavens, only to fall back to a silent, ignominious earth. The firing positions were finally located, but what lay there was a scene of profound absence. Investigators found only the massive concrete foundations, still bearing the ghost imprint of an immense weight. They found fragments of heavy-gauge railway track, twisted and discarded. They found empty wooden crates, once cradling shells of an unimaginable scale. But of the gun itself, there was nothing. The Germans had evacuated every piece of valuable equipment, leaving their conquerors nothing but industrial debris and a deepening mystery. French engineers pored over the salvaged details, attempting to reverse engineer the weapon's design from these meager scraps. The information was agonizingly scarce. A handful of captured shells that had failed to detonate were dissected in laboratories. But even this offered only a shadowy approximation of the cannon's true capabilities. Then, on the 11th of November, 1918, the armistice was signed. The Great War was over. With Germany's capitulation, the Allies gained the right to inspect German military installations and confiscate its armaments. Special commissions arrived with a singular purpose: to find and seize every specimen of advanced weaponry, chief among them the infamous Paris gun. The French, in particular, insisted on its surrender. They wanted not only to study its revolutionary engineering, but to display it as the ultimate trophy, a towering monument to Germany's defeat. Yet the hunt proved fruitless. The German High Command categorically denied the existence of any such ultra-long-range artillery. They offered no information, no records, no clues as to its whereabouts. Allied inspectors began a systematic sweep, combing through German arsenals, through the sprawling factories of the Krupp works, through railway depots and secret military warehouses. They found a staggering array of weaponry, from rifles to heavy howitzers, but the Paris gun was nowhere to be seen. The workers at Krupp, the very men who would have forged such a colossus, claimed they had never heard of such a project. Military archives held no blueprints, no documentation, no firing tables. An almost surreal impression began to form, that the entire story of the Paris bombardment was some fantastical invention. But the evidence was undeniable, carved into the very fabric of Paris itself. The craters, the shattered buildings, the testimony of the victims. The Germans remained silent, a unified wall of denial, refusing to discuss the topic even under the threat of sanctions. Of the war, had ordered every trace of the supergun's existence to be methodically erased. This weapon was the absolute pinnacle of German military engineering, and the generals would not allow its secrets to fall into the hands of the victors. The Greats, their unique steel lost forever among thousands of tons of other scrap metal. The carriages and platforms were dismantled, their components repurposed or buried, and every piece of technical documentation, the blueprints, the ballistic calculations, the after-action reports, was systematically burned or otherwise destroyed. The gun crews themselves received their final, most severe order: to never, under any circumstances, speak of their service with the secret weapon, under penalty of treason. All the Allies managed to capture were pathetic crumbs of a once terrible power. The weapon that held a city hostage had vanished, not just from the battlefield, but seemingly from reality itself. It had become a ghost, a phantom of steel and fire, proving that the most enduring legacy of war is sometimes not the destruction it creates, but the silence it leaves behind. In the scarred earth of post-war Europe, a new kind of battle was being waged, a battle for memory, for truth. Allied investigators sifted through the detritus of the German war machine, searching for the ghost of a weapon that had terrorized a capital from beyond the horizon. What they found were fragments, maddeningly incomplete pieces of a puzzle. Spare parts, components of breech blocks, intricate aiming mechanisms, and jagged shards of armored gun shields. Each piece was a clue, but a clue that led nowhere on its own. At a desolate, abandoned railway station, they made a significant discovery. 3 massive platforms, their very construction screaming of immense weight and singular purpose. They were clearly designed for the transport of a super-heavy artillery piece. These platforms were carefully dismantled and shipped to France, where engineers pored over every rivet and steel plate. But without the cannon itself, they could offer little more than educated guesses about its true characteristics. Then came the ammunition. Several unused shells were captured, each a 120-kilogram steel behemoth bearing distinctive markings and serial numbers. They were meticulously disassembled, their inner workings revealing the secrets of the munitions design. Yet the central mystery, the nature of the gun that had hurled them across the stratosphere, remained stubbornly unsolved. French intelligence redoubled its efforts, turning from cold steel to warm bodies. The hunt began for any surviving member of the Paris gun's crew. Agents moved through the weary ranks of demobilized German soldiers, dangling offers of money for information, even resorting to threats of prosecution for war crimes tied to the shelling of a civilian population. A few men, tempted by the reward, agreed to talk, but their testimonies were a tangled web of contradiction and fantasy. The stories were so wildly inconsistent, so incomplete, that verifying their authenticity was an impossible task. One veteran swore he had seen a cannon with a 40-meter barrel, housed within a gigantic concrete bunker. Another insisted there had not been one gun, but three, firing in a terrifying, staggered sequence. Still others spoke of fantastical rocket-propelled shells, powered by their own engines. Only one thing was clear: the truth was being deliberately obscured, and the eyewitness accounts were a chaotic blend of fact, rumor, and outright fabrication. These shadows and echoes. They analyzed the craters the shells had left in the soil of Paris, studied the trajectories of their impacts, and re-interviewed the aging witnesses of the bombardments. Ballistics specialists worked backwards, running complex calculations to determine what kind of weapon could propel a 120-kilogram projectile over a distance of 120 kilometers. The numbers that emerged from their work were, for the time, fantastic. A barrel length exceeding 30 meters, chamber pressures that surpassed any known metric, a muzzle velocity of more than 1.5 kilometers per second. Many specialists openly doubted that such a weapon could have even existed from a purely technical standpoint. Eventually, the intense interest in the Paris gun began to fade. A new era had dawned, bringing with it new, more terrifying instruments of war. Aviation was developing at a breathtaking pace. Soon, fleets of bombers could deliver a payload incomparably greater than a single 120-kilogram shell deep into enemy territory. Why build a gargantuan, immobile cannon costing millions of marks when a few aeroplanes could accomplish the same task with greater speed and flexibility? The supergun had become a relic, a testament to a brute force philosophy of war that was rapidly becoming obsolete. It was a monument to an ambition that was ultimately outpaced not by a bigger gun, but by an entirely new dimension of conflict. In the quiet aftermath of the Great War, the concept of super long-range artillery seemed to have died with the armistice. The Paris gun itself was relegated to the status of a historical curiosity, a staggering technical achievement, to be sure, but one utterly devoid of practical military sense. Yet, the German military leadership never truly abandoned the dream of giant cannons. Within the engineering halls of the Crépy works, the lessons learned were not forgotten. The invaluable experience gained from their audacious weapon led to new technologies for manufacturing impossibly long barrels and improved methods for calculating extreme ballistic trajectories. This relentless work eventually gave birth to the titans of the Second World War, the 800mm railway gun known as Dora, and the 600mm siege mortar, Karl Garret. These were monsters of steel, far more powerful than their predecessor, yet they inherited the same genetic flaws: an astronomical cost, cripplingly low mobility, and barrels that wore out with breathtaking speed, all for a tactical effectiveness that remained deeply questionable. But whispers from the trenches persisted for decades. Some veterans of the First War swore the Paris gun was not unique. They spoke of other, similar weapons of smaller caliber, designed to hold other French cities hostage. There were even rumors of a grander plan, an entire battery of such guns, which would systematically bombard France's crucial industrial centers, paralyzing its war factories and transport infrastructure. To this day, not a single document has been found to confirm these accounts. Perhaps they were merely projects that never left the drawing board. Or perhaps they are simply what remains when memory fades into myth. War legends born from the smoke and terror of a bygone era.